At exactly 3:17 in the morning, the prison corridor went silent. Not because nothing was happening, but because something had already gone terribly wrong. A steel door stood open. A camera was frozen on its last frame. And a man the authorities swore would never walk free again had vanished into the dark. This wasn't his first escape. It wasn't his second. It wasn't even his third. This was the fourth time an Albanian drug lord slipped through the hands of the justice system, and every escape left behind a trail of corruption, fear, and unanswered questions. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our next one. Across Europe, prison officials whispered the same name with unease. Prosecutors reread the same files in disbelief. And rival traffickers watched closely, because if he could escape again, then the system was weaker than anyone wanted to admit. This is not just the story of one man running from prison walls. This is the story of how power, money, and silence can bend institutions, and how one criminal became a living nightmare for every prison designed to hold him. He didn't start as a myth. He started as a street-smart teenager in Albania, during a time when borders were opening faster than laws could keep up. The collapse of old systems created new opportunities: black markets, smuggling routes, and criminal alliances stretching from the Balkans to Western Europe. By his early 20s, he was no longer just moving drugs. He was coordinating logistics, laundering profits, and recruiting people who would later swear they never truly knew who they were working for. Law enforcement would later describe him not as loud or flashy, but as patient, a man who let others take the risks while he controlled the flow. That patience would become his greatest weapon, especially behind bars. The first arrest came after months of surveillance and intercepted communications. Officers believed they had dismantled a major trafficking operation. Headlines celebrated the capture. Cameras flashed. Politicians praised international cooperation. But inside the holding cell, the man remained calm. Because even then, he understood something most criminals don't. Prison is not the end of the game. It's just another environment to study, another system to learn, another structure to exploit. The prison was old, overcrowded, and understaffed, a common problem across parts of Europe dealing with transnational crime. Guards rotated frequently. Cameras malfunctioned. Records were handwritten and poorly synchronized. Within weeks, he knew which guards were overworked, which inmates were desperate, and which routines never changed. He didn't threaten. He didn't rush. He offered favors. Small things at first: money sent to families, protection inside the yard, legal help arranged from the outside. By the time officials realized he was still coordinating operations from the inside, it was already too late. The first escape shocked the country. During what was supposed to be a routine transfer, paperwork was delayed. A vehicle arrived late. A guard followed instructions that would later be described as unclear. Somehow, in the chaos, restraints were loosened. A door opened. And within minutes, he was gone. Authorities called it a failure of procedure. Internal reviews promised reform. But behind closed doors, investigators suspected something far worse: cooperation. Months later, he was found in another country, living quietly under an assumed identity. The rearrest was less dramatic, but far more humiliating for law enforcement. How does a man escape once and disappear across borders without help? This time, officials swore they would make an example of him. He was transferred to a different prison with tighter security, fewer privileges, and constant monitoring. They believed the lesson had been learned. They were wrong. The second escape didn't rely on chaos. It relied on timing. A maintenance window. A blind spot in camera coverage. A door that was supposed to stay locked during night hours. When alarms finally sounded, investigators noticed something chilling. Several security failures happened in perfect sequence. Too perfect to be accidental. This is when the narrative changed. The question was no longer how he escaped. It was who helped him, and how deep the corruption went. After the second escape, international alerts went out. Border agencies were warned. Intelligence units shared profiles. His name became shorthand for institutional embarrassment. Yet even as the net tightened, the man remained elusive. Some believed he was hiding in plain sight. Others believed he never stopped running the very networks that had made him powerful in the first place. When he was captured again, officials chose a prison known for housing high-risk inmates. Reinforced walls, limited contact, constant surveillance. This facility had a reputation. No successful escapes in decades. For the public, it felt like closure. For him, it was a challenge. The third escape would later be described as structurally impossible. And yet, it happened. Some reports mentioned altered schedules. Others pointed to manipulated logs. One detail appeared in every investigation. Critical decisions were made by people who later claimed they were just following routine. By now, fear replaced disbelief. If prisons couldn't hold him, what could? The fourth arrest came with unprecedented restrictions. No contact. No trust. No margin for error. Officials promised transparency, independent oversight, digital tracking. And for a while, it worked. Then came the night that changed everything. A power fluctuation. A delayed response. A guard who looked the other way, or claimed he never saw anything at all. By the time the lockdown was initiated, the cell was empty. 4 prisons. 4 escapes. And a justice system left staring at the same question. Was this man escaping, or was he being released? What followed would expose networks far beyond one prison. Financial trails. Political pressure. Quiet dismissals. And as the man vanished once again, investigators realized the truth might be more dangerous than the criminal himself. In the hours after the fourth escape, the prison went into what officials later called controlled panic. Phones were ringing off the hook. Supervisors wanted answers, but nobody had any. Logs were being rewritten, timelines adjusted, and blame was quietly passed around. Publicly, the authorities talked about ongoing investigations. But privately, something much more chilling was happening. People were going silent. Guards who had talked openly after the previous escapes were now lawyering up. Administrators gave vague, evasive answers. It wasn't just about being punished. It was about what might be exposed. Investigators soon realized the key wasn't inside the prison walls. It was in bank records. They started following the money, uncovering shell companies and a series of small, unexplained transfers. They found a financial network that hadn't missed a beat just because its leader was locked up. The money moved in careful amounts, never large enough to trigger an alarm, but steady enough to buy loyalty. Some of these payments lined up perfectly with key moments: a guard being transferred, a schedule change, even prison renovations that conveniently created new blind spots. This wasn't a prison break. It was a highly organized logistical operation. To understand how one man escaped 4 times, you have to understand the prisons he escaped from. We are talking about aging buildings, chronic understaffing, and guards pulling double shifts for very modest pay. In an environment like that, rules bend. Procedures become mere suggestions. And for a criminal with deep pockets, you don't need violence. You just need patience. As experts later testified, these prisons weren't defeated by force. They were eroded from the inside out. Several guards were suspended. A few resigned. One simply vanished from all public records. At first, no one was officially charged. The party line was insufficient evidence. But investigators saw a disturbing pattern. Every single escape involved at least one staff member who was going through a tough time, financial hardship, family problems, or facing disciplinary action. Coercion doesn't always look like a straightforward bribe. Sometimes, it looks a lot like survival. Outside the prison, his story was becoming a legend. In criminal circles, his escapes weren't just wins, they were proof. Proof that the system could be outsmarted. Proof that loyalty pays. Young traffickers spoke his name like it was a blueprint for success. Even his rivals feared him more on the outside than behind bars. Because if he could just walk out of prison whenever he felt like it, what else could he control? The case was now a major embarrassment for multiple countries. European agencies demanded answers. Governments scheduled hearings and formed special committees. But every investigation hit the same dead end. There was no single catastrophic failure to point to. Instead, each escape was the result of a long chain of small decisions. None of these were criminal on their own, but when you put them all together, the result was devastating. Journalists started digging into a quieter angle: his family. They weren't flashy or loud, but they were strategically placed. Relatives owned businesses near major ports, warehouses along key transit routes, and properties hidden under layers of ownership. Even from his cell, he was connected. Not through phones or secret messages, but through a web of trust that had been built long before he was ever arrested. Then, one former associate broke the silence. Speaking from a secure location, he described a system built on favors, not orders. He said the escapes were never rushed. Every single detail was rehearsed mentally, long before it happened. The goal wasn't just freedom at any cost, it was certainty. If the conditions weren't absolutely perfect, the plan was off. And that's why they always worked. Looking back at that fourth escape, a chilling detail emerged. There was no sign of urgency, no frantic rush, no mistakes. He even left personal items behind, things no fugitive running for their life would abandon. It suggested something truly radical. He didn't believe he was escaping danger. He believed he was simply transitioning back to a position of control. So, where did he go? Authorities had their theories: remote villages, fake passports, smuggling routes by sea. But intelligence analysts noticed something else. Right after the escape, activity spiked in known trafficking corridors. New leaders emerged, but their decisions mirrored his style: cautious, strategic, and incredibly patient. It raised an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe he never really disappeared at all. The system, of course, responded, but it was too late. Reforms were announced. New technology was installed. Staff were retrained. But reforms always come after the damage is done. The real question wasn't if the prisons could be fixed. It was if public trust could ever be restored. The message was loud and clear: if someone with enough power wants out, walls alone won't stop them. At this point, the story was no longer about one Albanian drug lord. He became a symbol of a world where crime moves faster than justice, where our institutions are struggling against invisible, global networks. Even in his absence, he was shaping policy, embarrassing governments, and rewriting the very definition of escape in the modern era. Months later, a single tip came in. It was vague and unconfirmed. A sighting, a familiar walk, a man who never looked over his shoulder because he didn't believe anyone could touch him anymore. Investigators reopened files they hoped were closed for good. If the story had ended with his escape, it would have been unforgettable. But what came next would force authorities to face something far worse than failure: the possibility that the system didn't just lose control. It never truly had it in the first place. The hunt was back on, but this time, it was different. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic press conferences. The authorities had learned a hard lesson. Public attention didn't catch the man, it only fed his myth. So, they went quiet. Instead of looking for a person, they started looking for patterns. They scanned for shifts in supply routes, subtle changes in communication networks, and a sudden, unnatural discipline among criminal groups that were usually a chaotic mess. And slowly, a familiar signature began to emerge from the noise. It's what experienced investigators call the signature of control. Every top-tier trafficker leaves a behavioral fingerprint. Payments that once overlapped suddenly stopped. Turf wars that had been raging for months disappeared overnight. High-risk, high-reward deals were quietly abandoned. Someone was managing operations from the shadows again. And whoever it was, they understood restraint better than ambition. It was the exact same pattern they'd seen right before every single one of his previous escapes. With pressure mounting, a sealed internal review was discreetly unsealed. Inside were assessments written years earlier, warnings that this particular inmate posed a systemic risk. Not because he was violent, but because he adapted. The reports recommended a level of isolation so extreme it bordered on legal grey areas. But those recommendations were never fully implemented. Budget cuts, legal challenges, political hesitation, each compromise was another crack in the wall. Behind closed doors, officials started pointing fingers. Not about his guilt, that was never in question, but about who was to blame. Admitting a failure of this magnitude meant admitting the entire system was vulnerable. And that kind of vulnerability could shatter public trust. So the official narrative was carefully managed. The escapes were reframed as rare anomalies, isolated incidents caused by individual errors or just plain bad luck. But anomalies don't repeat themselves 4 times. Experts would later testify that modern prisons are built to contain individuals, not networks. Walls can stop a body, but they can't stop influence. And this man understood that better than anyone who ever tried to hold him. A former guard, long since retired, finally agreed to speak, but only anonymously. He described a culture where pressure was never direct. It was a favor here, a problem solved there. There were no threats, no explicit orders. Just a quiet, unspoken understanding that refusing to cooperate would make life harder, not just for you inside the prison, but for your family outside it, too. But the fourth escape was different. Unlike the others, it wasn't followed by chaos in the criminal underworld. There was no power vacuum, no mad scramble for control. Everything just continued. Business as usual, as if nothing had changed. And that's when investigators realized something truly chilling. This escape wasn't an emergency plan. It was scheduled. Time was always his greatest ally. He would wait out investigations, let public outrage fade into memory, and allow new security reforms to get bogged down in bureaucracy. And only when the conditions were perfectly aligned, when the world's attention had drifted elsewhere, he would make his move. Never impulsively. Always with chilling precision. Witnesses never describe him as paranoid or reckless. They said he was calm, deliberate. Even during high-security transfers, surrounded by armed guards, he never appeared nervous. Because running implies fear. And fear was a tool he outsourced to others. For him, each incarceration was an education. He learned which rules could bend under pressure, which systems relied on trust instead of verification, and most importantly, which people actually mattered, and which ones only appeared to. Prison wasn't punishment. It was a masterclass in exploiting the system from the inside. Quietly, his name began to appear in new policy drafts, in training manuals, and in high-level risk assessments. He was never acknowledged publicly, but his influence was profound. Future inmates would face harsher restrictions and more sophisticated surveillance, all because he exposed the system's deepest flaws. In a way, he single-handedly reshaped prison security across the continent, without ever asking for permission. This forces us to ask a fundamental question. Was he simply escaping prison? Or was he demonstrating that the very concept of prison no longer worked the way authorities believed it did? Because if you can exercise complete control without being physically present, then what's the point of a cage? Incarceration itself loses its meaning. The last confirmed trace of him wasn't from a border crossing or a grainy surveillance camera. It came from a financial anomaly, a series of transactions so clean, so disciplined, that it couldn't possibly be random. The digital trail went cold shortly after. But by then, the investigators already knew the truth. He wasn't just gone, he had ascended to a different level of operation. Whether he's alive, in hiding, or protected by layers of unwavering loyalty, his influence lingers like a ghost in the machine. Prisons have tightened their procedures. Governments have reviewed their failures. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of any law, a man continues to prove that true power doesn't need a spotlight to exist. And this is where we have to pause the story. Not because it's over, but because it refuses to end. The fourth escape wasn't a conclusion. It was a message. A message that, to this day, the system is still trying to decode.